get out of here.
Let's go.
Life 2017, Alien Creature Explained. If you're into ambiguous open endings, 2017's science fiction horror film should be at the top of your watch list. Directed by Daniel Espinosa and written by Paul Wernick and Rhett Reese, the movie revels in an extraterrestrial setting with a star-studded cast. Jake Gyllenhaal, Rebecca Ferguson, and Ryan Reynolds feature in prominent roles in the movie, along with Ariyon Bakare, Olga Dihovichnaya, and Hiroyuki Sanada, as they form a 6-member astronaut crew in the International Space Station that discovers life on Mars. Music composer Jon Ekstrand scored the music for life. As you'd expect with horror, the music was atonal and dissonant, which helped evoke tension. However, he does use more orchestral and melodic elements initially, so as to not give away the horrifying nature of the movie, which is exposed later. He referenced the music from 2001's Space Odyssey while scoring for life. As the horror of the plot is exposed, the organism turns hostile and tension builds up in an already claustrophobic setting. The climax, spoiler alert, results in the death of everyone except Gyllenhaal's David, and the movie ends without any closure or a satisfying ending. So if you're excited to know more about this, let's get right into this. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. The Attack of Calvin. A group of astronauts are sent to Mars. Instead of landing on the planet, they send a space probe called Pilgrim 7 to collect soil samples from there. When it returns to the Earth's orbit, Dr. Hugh Derry tests it in an incubator and strikes upon the existence of extraterrestrial life. It was a single-celled organism, but it was dormant.
Pilgrim wasn't just seeing things in the Mars soil. We're looking at a large single cell.
After decreasing the temperature of the incubator, it gradually began to grow and turned into a multicellular organism in a few days.
We're looking at the first incontrovertible proof of life beyond Earth.
The message is transmitted to Earth, and the children in American schools decide to name it Calvin. Derry learns that the organism is smart, as it would shake hands with him and it could change its specifications, acting as neurons, muscles, and photosensory cells. Days pass by and Calvin stops responding. Derry gives it a shock to revive it, but the thing latches onto his palm, crushing his bones. Derry is knocked unconscious and Calvin tries to escape. After a fair amount of struggle, it cleverly escapes the incubator and devours a lab rat. It then grows in size. Engineer Rory Adams enters the laboratory in the spaceship to rescue Derry. Despite managing to do so, Rory gets stuck in a rut himself as Calvin latches itself onto his calf. To not put the other astronauts in jeopardy, he is quarantined in the lab. The captain of the ship, Miranda, tries to help him fight the thing and asks him to use heat.
Get an oxygen candle. Burn it off.
Yeah.
As Calvin had stopped being dormant after Derry reduced the temperature in the incubator. Rory is successfully able to get Calvin away from him at first, but it enters his mouth like it did with the rat. He is killed while the other astronauts release toxic fumes in that room to kill Calvin. They also try to close all the fire control vents, but Calvin manages to escape through one of them. Immediately, the astronauts send a message to Earth describing the dangerous nature of Calvin. However, the transmitter malfunctions and they lose communication. ISS Commander Ekaterina offers to check the transmitters and detects overheating problems. As she tries to probe further into the problem and accessing the cooling system, she finds Calvin in the transmitter. It springs into action and sticks itself to Ekaterina's spacesuit tightly, attempting to infiltrate it. However, due to the spacesuit's secure nature, it is unable to do so. But its coolant pipe for oxygen and temperature regulation breaks, so Ekaterina's helmet gets fogged with moisture, blocking her vision. Miranda and Sho try to bring her inside, but she closes the door to prevent Calvin from attacking others. She is now stranded in space with Calvin drowning in her helmet and ultimately dies. Unfortunately, Calvin survives and tries to re-enter the ship through its thrusters. The crew fires at it, but it only adds to their woes as it ends up draining an exorbitant amount of fuel, causing the ISS to enter a decaying orbit where it can get burnt while entering Earth's atmosphere. Also, they couldn't risk Calvin entering Earth. With great difficulty, they managed to stabilize the ship, but are forced to turn the thrusters off in the process. So Calvin re-enters the ship. They seal themselves on one side of the ship and plan to render Calvin dormant by venting the atmosphere on its side. Derry's health begins to deteriorate rapidly as he suffers a heart attack. The others try to defibrillate him, but find out that Calvin had wrapped itself on his leg all this while and had been feeding off him. Due to Derry being a paraplegic below the waist, he hadn't felt its presence. He dies. Calvin attacks the other astronauts as they attempt to reach the other end of the ship. Sho Murakami seals himself in a sleeping pod while Calvin tries to break inside. David and Miranda use Derry's corpse as bait to lure Calvin away from them and trap it in the other end. As it ate Derry's body, the ISS is intercepted by a Soyuz spacecraft attempting to push them deeper into space. The astronauts initially thought it was to rescue them, but their message about Calvin being dangerous had reached Earth before the transmitter went haywire, and the Soyuz was a failsafe for Earth's protection. Sho boarded the spacecraft, but having passed through the segment where Miranda and David had contained Calvin, it enters the Soyuz with Sho and obliterates the crew. Sho sacrifices himself while trying to trap Calvin. The Soyuz detaches and crashes into the ISS. Its orbit decays once again. Only David and Miranda were left in the ship, and they speculate that even if the Earth's atmosphere destroyed the ISS, Calvin could possibly survive and enter Earth, so they plan to use one of the escape pods to throw Calvin out into space. David decides to drive the pod with Calvin into deep space to isolate it, while Miranda uses the other pod to return to Earth. This would also mean that David would die. David uses himself as bait to make Calvin latch onto him and enters one pod, but Miranda's pod is hit by debris, causing it to go haywire. Calvin attacks David, but instead of killing him, it wraps itself around him. Miranda's pod flies, and she sends a message to Earth warning them about Calvin.
Or eliminated, and if this creature ever reaches Earth, use every available...
One of the pods enters Earth and lands on the sea. It is found by Vietnamese fishermen while the other pod is lost in space. However, it turns out that the pod that landed was David's instead of Miranda's. He warns the fishermen, but they open the pod while the other boats begin to arrive. Meanwhile, Miranda's pod goes off the rails into deep space and the movie ends ambiguously.
Tell the committee pilgrims landed on Plymouth Rock. Them are samples.
Review. As someone who absolutely loves the Alien series and 2001 Space Odyssey, Life was right up any space lover's alley. Despite having such heavyweight names in the ensemble cast, Life is not afraid to take risks, which is evident as Ryan Reynolds' character Rory Adams is killed off very early into the film. Espinosa has managed to create a sense of outer space mayhem with Life as every character tries to save themselves from a terrifying foreign creature, which often reminds me of the symbiote from Venom. Well, to some extent, and the Blob. Jon Ekstrand's score is something that really stood out for its sheer brilliance. However, Life does not do anything that hasn't been seen before in movies with similar settings. On top of that, the open endings with David's pod reaching Earth with Calvin does not invoke satisfaction, but it does set up the potential for a sequel.
Calvin needs oxygen to survive. With the O2 level so low in the rest of the ship, it will be drawn to the oxygen.
Exploring Calvin, the Havoc-Inducing alien. The primary antagonist of 2017 sci-fi horror Life is the alien creature from Mars, which was affectionately named Calvin by the school students of the US. This species is a supercell, and it could be theorized, despite having been found in Mars, Calvin was not from Mars itself. Life teases with the idea that there was once a time where there was life on Mars. According to how life exists on Earth, life resembling humans could not have existed on Mars due to a vast difference in temperature and gravitational pull. Even though this causes some to believe that the atmosphere in Mars is not compatible for life, it is likely to give rise to a very different form of life. However, lower gravitational pull is likely to result in a taller life form. But Calvin does not have any standardized appearance and instead mutates depending on what it preys on. It then goes on to increase in size depending on the amount of mass it is consumed. Initially, it looks like a bunch of strings bundled together when it took a multicellular form, but towards the end of the movie, it displayed its Y-tinted frame as it cocooned Derek. As several forms of life exist on Earth, something similar can be expected of other planets. However, according to the test results from the Martian soil, no other life form except Calvin existed. This could lead to the theory that Calvin's aggressive species overran Mars and destroyed life there until there was only one of them remaining. With a loss in the ecosystem, the biosphere of a planet is bound to change. It might have caused Calvin to evolve into a hibernating species similar to bacteria. It is much easier for single-celled organisms to survive when compared to multicellular ones, and this could have been what caused Calvin to be a single-celled alien creature in the beginning. So, as it is incredibly resilient, exterminating it might require a lot more than putting it in a hostile environment, since it could just readjust itself according to wherever it is. It was also able to survive in the space vacuum, but being constantly exposed to radiation might make a difference, unless of course, it finds a way to deal with that as well. It did have a disposition against heat though, so constant proximity to fire or being burnt could possibly kill Calvin. However, that was not an option in life, as they could not set the ship on fire while being in outer space. In the movie, it was retrieved when 6 astronauts from the International Space Station collected soil samples from Mars to check for life on the red planet. He was initially found as a single-celled organism, but after being nurtured by a fair bit of exobiologist Hugh Derry, Calvin mutated into a multicellular organism with the help of water and nutrients and was of significant intelligence.
It needs food, water, and oxygen just like us. We have to consider the possibility it consumed the coolant for food.
During its early days, when it was only a few centimeters in size, it could change its form and shake hands with Derry. Its neurons, muscles, and photosensory cells acted all at once, which means that each of its cells acted as a nerve, an eye, and a muscle all at once. It was believed to be the dominant species of Martian soil. However, the crew was not aware of the fact that it would turn violent and go on a rampage, as it seemed quite cooperative at first. The organism is a white, translucent creature that grows in size after devouring its prey. It is evidently very aggressive and intelligent, as seen throughout the movie. Its nerves were visible through its body once it had grown in size. It also has tentacle-like limbs, which it uses to latch on to its prey. Instances of its intelligence have been present throughout the movie, the first one being its cooperativeness. However, it probably prefers being dormant, since that's how he was found and that's the state it went back to after a few days of cooperating with Hugh Derry. After being rejuvenated with a shock, Calvin began to display aggressiveness when it crushed Derry's fist. Following that, it attempted to escape the incubator, but due to Derry's glove, it was stuck. But since it possessed intelligence, it uses a nearby electric pen to penetrate through the gloves. During the scene where it was enclosed in the ship as toxic fumes were released, Calvin attempted to locate fire escape vents for survival. It also knew exactly what it should do during the transmitter scene, as it destroyed the machinations of the transmitter by overheating it, to prevent the crew from transmitting the message about it being dangerous.
So we've lost contact with Earth.
I don't think... Wait.
It might not be as intelligent as humans, as it has no speech and possibly cannot do things like build a spacecraft. However, it is far intellectually superior compared to the creatures on Earth. It possessed significant tactical and strategic intelligence, as it always knew what it should do to infiltrate the spacecraft and take over its prey.
How is that moving like that?
He must have swallowed them.
For example, after being taken out of the spaceship by Ekaterina, Calvin was able to figure out that the only way it could re-enter the ship was through the thrusters. It also had enough awareness to steer David's ship away from the deep space and into Earth. Even though the creature does not communicate via speech, it could be deducted that it had a primary objective. Having obliterated all life on Mars, it probably wanted to do the same on Earth, which is why it was adamant on reaching Earth and attempted to sever communications when the crew tried to contact Earth. Being a parasitic creature meant that it could enter the bodies of living beings and kill the host. That's what it does at first with a rat in the laboratory, which causes it to grow. It does the same with Rory, Hugh, and the crew at Soyuz, growing in size with each conquest. As Earth did not have compatible technology to defeat Calvin, who was a highly resistant creature, its stint killing people here would have probably had a long run. Calvin displayed superhuman strength from a very early phase in its life, as it crushed Derry's hand with ease despite being only a few centimeters in size. While fighting David in the pod, a much stronger Calvin was able to hold David back from taking it deep into space and was able to make him crash land on Earth. Its prowess of accelerated growth after consuming humans or animals was another contributing factor to its extreme strength, making him more powerful with each parasitic conquest. It could also absorb energy or blood for its growth. It wouldn't be accurate to state that it was evil because despite being intelligent, it did not show signs of emotional conduct. Apart from the scene where it shook hands with Derry, but that's not a strong enough argument in this case. It did not come to Earth to conquer it or rule over it. It could simply be assumed that the species Calvin belonged to needed to feed on a living host constantly for survival, and due to the lack of life barring its own species on Mars, it required another source of nutrition, and that's why it wanted to come to Earth.
Medium. In this case, glucose.
However, as it evolves rapidly, it could be assumed that the creature also evolved in terms of intelligence.
1120 UTC.
Hold on to your helmets. The glucose intake is very rapid.
As is seen when it does make indirect attempts at communications later on in the movie with Jake Gyllenhaal's character David. Also, despite killing off his other preys before, it did not do the same with David as it did not feel the need to kill him. Or it could have developed emotional range as it evolved, and since David was the only character who did not attack Calvin, it did not want to harm David either. Contrary to that, everyone else in the spacecraft had tried to kill it, starting with Hugh Derry, who electrocuted it from its state of hibernation, which is the first instance of it turning aggressive. Following that incident, it could have easily assumed humans to be a threat and done whatever it did for self-survival. You must have heard of the phrase, "Until the lion learns how to write, the story will always glorify the hunter." So, looking at this situation from two separate perspectives, the astronaut crew was the antagonist from Calvin's point of view, and it did whatever it did for its own survival.
But he has to kill us in order to survive.
Similarly, Calvin was the antagonist from the crew's perspective, and they did whatever they did for their survival.
Calvin was growing very fast, and this has now given me time to reinforce firewall precautions.
How does the parasitic supercell from Mars absorb and destroy human life? Every time Calvin absorbs biomass, it undergoes significant changes. When it absorbs the rat in the laboratory, it doesn't just kill it or take over it, but the rat's organ system interpolates itself into Calvin itself. It increases in size and gains a circulatory system which is visible from its translucent body. Even though it possesses inherent intelligence, Calvin gets intelligent enough to outsmart humans once it absorbs Rory. If it was able to absorb the rat, it probably did the same with Rory and acquired his brain patterns, because when it was segregated in the room with fumes, it knew that it had to escape from a fire vent. It also knew about the mechanisms of the transmitter and its way around the spacecraft. Since Rory was the mechanic in the ISS spaceship, he was well versed with the machinations of the ship. Having absorbed his brain, Calvin was also able to learn about whatever Rory knew. Is Calvin like the Blob? Similar to Calvin, the Blob is an alien entity with antagonistic tendencies, and they have pretty similar mutating styles. Both Calvin and the Blob can absorb humans, animals, or the biomass in its path to grow inside. Both the entities make their first move by attacking the hand of the other person. In case of Calvin, it was Derry's hand which was crushed, whereas in case of the old man, the Blob dissolved his hand using acid. The Blob is also incredibly resilient, just like Calvin, and is almost indestructible. Conventional weapons are practically useless against it. However, it did have one weakness, which is quite the opposite compared to that of Calvin. As Calvin has shown a fondness for lower temperatures and is not particularly fond of heat, the Blob's major weakness was a lack thereof, as it could be stopped when others tried to freeze it. When it comes to appearance, Calvin and the Blob might look different at first glance, primarily due to a difference in color and shape, as Calvin is translucent and has a form, while the Blob is red and just a slime-like deformed mass. However, both the creatures had the ability to form tentacles out of its own mass to capture its target. Calvin and the Blob have also shown significant dexterity in their movements. Both creatures can go through narrow spaces and possess inhuman strength. In the Blob 1988, The origin of the Blob is a bit different, as it is the product of bacteria mutating due to outer space radiation. Calvin is also theoretically a product of changes in the conditions of its environment in space, as it is suspected to evolve into its current form due to the atmosphere of Mars being stripped away. However, this is debatable.
Initiating manual override.
What will happen with Calvin after its arrival on Earth? Since Calvin has allegedly driven Martian life into extinction, it might attempt to do the same on Earth. With substantial life being present here, it will only grow stronger and more intelligent with every person and creature it absorbs. At first, it is likely to consume the biomass of the Vietnamese fishermen and then from the ecosystem around it. It could eventually become an entity like Ultron from Avengers: Age of Ultron, not in terms of morality, but definitely in terms of cyber ability. As it absorbs more and more information and neuron signals from people, it learns more and more about the planet and of course about the internet. With higher intelligence, it can overrun the cyberspace of the planet and exterminate any plan to destroy it by just being able to track it down and ruining it at the source. Let's say the scientists decide to use gamma radiation on it. Calvin will probably find out about it before they can make a move and destroy the machinations they would use or the people who would conduct it. As it absorbs more and more biomass, it gets bigger and bigger. With its abnormal intelligence and resilience, it will also become invincible. There is no information about its gender or its reproductive abilities, but it is safe to assume that Calvin can conduct asexual reproduction. It could butt itself into several other Calvins, similar to Starro the Conqueror from the DC Comics, who could butt out smaller starfishes from its otherwise ginormous starfish body. It will gradually overrun the planet, obliterating all life from it. If it was just humans, the Earth would not change. Rather, the environment would get better. However, as it will also absorb all the creatures on the planet, it will eventually cause a massive change in the environment and ecosystem of the planet. And similar to Mars, Earth might become a barren land which will be incompatible for life, and Calvin will go back to square one of hibernation for its survival. It's an optimistic scenario. Calvin is unable to deal with a new environment on Earth, and despite its resilience, shows some flaws that can be exploited. The military intelligence studies those flaws and tries to deploy countermeasures, which ultimately leads to the creature's demise. It could also dive into Calvin's emotional nature. Since David is the only one who did not attempt to harm him, Calvin does not harm David either. Calvin's future on Earth could be about trying to cooperate and communicate with humans. It might develop thoughts of its own that do not stem from the neural patterns of the biomass it has absorbed. It may also deal with the emotions of all the people it has absorbed, causing him to enter a deregulated emotional state. For a very existential ending, it might want to give up on life following the feeling of emotions of several humans. With a well-developed bond with David, he might be the only one to finally kill Calvin, following Calvin's directions on how his species can be killed. This is unlikely to happen since the first movie has substantial amounts of thrill, horror, and action, so its fans might want something very similar from a possible sequel.
Oh my God.
It worked.
Is life likely to have a sequel? Open endings are not uncommon for Hollywood. Not just Hollywood, but several horror movies tend to have an open ending. Also, this might look like it's being set up for a sequel. Not all movies go on to have one. The film, although interesting with a star-studded cast, is not one that collected the big bucks in the box office or is the darling of the critics. With Paul Wernick and Rhett Reese at the helm of screenwriting, some ideas are being bounced, as they have discussed what they could do with a sequel if it were to go into production. It also depends on what direction the director wishes to take. In an interview with Sci-Fi Wire, Daniel Espinosa talks about not requiring to make a sequel for Life, as his objective was to not destroy the creature, but give it a well-rounded character arc. Since people want a resolution, the changes in Calvin's emotional state in the pod with David gives them that. This is not someone who wants to destroy Earth, and rather has developed a connection. However, he does not rule out all the chances of a possible sequel, as he says that the producers might want one more, but it is less likely to be one where Calvin destroys the Earth, since that is not what Espinosa wants. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks everyone.
We're looking at the first incontrovertible proof of life beyond Earth.